So, welcome anybody, to this Resurrecting Civility podcast. That's a fancy name, the podcast is, for a project that's getting pounded out. I'm leading it. A number of other folks are joining, coming along for the conversation. For working sessions where we're working our way through a new way of looking at human beings, a new way of looking at our world. It's a way which brings us together, as the name implies, as the potential to do that. It's a way of harnessing some older resources now neglected. One might even consider them dead resources, also, which the name implies, resurrecting these resources, tapping them to find a way forward in a civil and ultimately a loving sort of way. So this is a working session, and normally these working sessions are twofold, threefold, fourfold, several of us. We conduct these 3 days a week, the first Mondays and Fridays. The first and the last of those are about 90 minutes each, just pounding through a variety of material that's prepared in this in this effort to bring this project to life. In the center, on Wednesdays, we take 90 minutes. Sometimes 90 minutes becomes 2 hours here and there, but we take some time and we look through, as we did, for example, the last time we were together. We worked through some open topic. Last time was on, say, the nature of wildfires and the big problems for managing forests that those pose, and how on earth we'll ever get big problems like those solved in our current contentious political life, which leading us to yet another of those problems, and a causal one, the role of money in politics and the commitment to free speech that we all have, and how money and free speech, how spending money on speech is or is not an exercise in free speech, when it is, when it isn't. And that was a good example, a good discussion, and a good example of an open topic. But tonight we're going to revisit, and I'm going to run it solo here for the first time I've done this, live on YouTube, that is. We're going to take a hard look at a very important piece, a three-lens spiral matrix. We've been working at the idea of seeing the world differently and suggesting that, like a spiral, one can't see the world differently all at once, and one has to take it on in a transformative sort of way. We're breaking that journey, which nobody says consists of three lenses or any number of single lenses, but it is a useful metaphor, the metaphor of a lens. And a lens is made up of a number of insights that hang together and together do more work together than one might at least imagine, that more than the sum of their parts. There's a kind of synergy, a kind of power, explanatory power, predictive power, guiding power. We know what to think and we know what to do more clearly as a result of holding these pieces together and letting these pieces that together make up a lens fashion the way we look at the world. That's what a lens is, and we're going to look at three of them. This whole project, this Resurrecting Civility project, is broken up into the crafting of these three lenses and the taking on of each of the subsequent two after the previous one, and then after the previous two. We're stacking them one at a time. Why in that particular order, that particular way? Well, it seems like it works well. That's the best answer I have going at the moment. There may be deeper answers which we'll want to explore, but for now, that's what we're up to. Starting again, before we dive into the very work of articulating each of those three lenses afresh and trying particularly to identify those elements which come together in each of these three lenses and work together to produce a kind of superior clarity in looking at the world. Before we do that, let's back out just a moment and use a metaphor. There's several actually that we use to think about this project as a whole. One of those metaphors is the metaphor of something like a league where one intends to invent the rules to a new game and build a team that develops a craft of playing that game well, but of course can't do that, not if it's a competitive game, without also building a league that brings together others, that invites people in who are not going to do exactly the same, but they're not going to be on the same team. They're going to be on a different team, in fact, a rival team, and the league progresses through, the craft develops through the friendly antagonism, the competition between these different teams. So one way to look at this, this whole project is that we're trying to invent the rules of a new game and attract a number of teams to the league, and then push one of those teams forward to see where the craft of playing in that league could actually be developed. That's a useful metaphor, and here's a second one. We can also see this as something like an invitation, not to a league now, but to a town, where the town shares a kind of infrastructure in the way that towns actually do, where there's water and sewerage and there's garbage, there's a tax structure, there's education. There are various pieces which anybody who moves to town and wants to live there and puts up a building will somehow find a way to tap into. That infrastructure, tapping into that infrastructure, is actually the analog of building this first lens. The first lens is that town infrastructure. And to communicate it is to lay out something like a blueprint in which somebody's invited to come and put up a building. It won't be the only building in this town, it will be one building. We're going to go on to build a building on that same infrastructure once we lay it out. And that building that we build will be a second lens added to that first lens, added to that first infrastructure. That building that we build is built so as to invite people to come to live in it. It's a way of life. It's a group of people that want to live together and pursue a certain way of life together. That invitation requires people to leave behind in some way the places that they're already living. And so we can see the construction of that new building by adding some additional pieces as inviting one group of people, and then a second additional lens, a second additional set of propositions that hold together, that do work together. That second set answers another set of challenges that would face anybody who would be invited to come in. The invitations we want to issue, frankly, are invitations to academics, invitations to scientists, invitations to Americans, and invitations to Christians. All of those sorts of groups, and there are many who live in all those groups, and there are some who live just in one or two of them. But what we're trying to do is put together a building which appeals to all of those groups and which develops a craft of effectively inviting members from those various groups to come in. That craft involves the telling of a story which taps into stories which members of these other groups already tell themselves in the places where they live, that is to say, in the intellectual world and the social world that they inhabit, and the agreements, the stories that they share with others in that world. Somehow you have to do something with those things that they think they already know, those values that they already hold, and you either have to subvert them, namely get people to leave them behind because something really else is happening here, and yet it's more attractive in spite of the fact that you need to leave a number of things behind. That's that kind of subversion from jumping from one narrative or one story to another is a painful, difficult turn. It's a painful, difficult change. Another possibility is not subversion, but a kind of transformation, so that someone comes forward precisely because they hold the story that they hold, and they see now that holding it where they held it and thinking only what they thought isn't the way forward for them on their own terms. In fact, there's a better way forward here, and it isn't different, it completes it. So whether it's subversion or transformation, these lenses that we're going to look at, all of them they invite different types of people. Ultimately, then these invitations would have to be tailored to particular types of people. That's a point that we'll have to come back to another time, because the kind of transformation is from a place where people are to a place where they hold some things in common, if they accept and come in and actually move in and become transformed and see the world differently in this new, different sort of way. That's a very precise transition, maybe different for every single individual person, but maybe there are clusters of differences from some types of people. Some types of people have a lot of things in common, and so will respond well, will require, in order to move, that requires certain rhetorical devices. Certain things will have to look good to them. And there are groups of people who hold those things in common. So in any case, inviting a whole range of people to live this different way, to think this different way, to adopt these lenses, and in fact, to adopt them one at a time. Something like that is a long-winded account of what this Resurrecting Civility project is all about. And I say all that by way of background for this 3-lens spiral matrix that we're now about to take a little bit closer look at. Okay. So what 3 lenses? Well, there are 3 of them. And I'm going to take them one at a time, divide and conquer here. And some of this exercise here is to work our way through a bulleted list with the idea that behind each bullet is a more carefully stated claim about the world, something that's said to be true, perhaps something that's said to be good, valuable. Those various claims are somehow sitting behind because we're trying to put them in. We're trying to find a quick tag to place on each one of these things and then grab the whole by the little tag as if by a handle. So these bullets then are a whole bunch of handles on these various propositions that come together, and when they're together, do work together to illuminate and guide. So what are these 3 lenses? For those who are part of the project following along, you've heard them before. Maybe more than you ever expected that you'd hear about any of them. But the first lens is called the High Information Flow Network of Rich Communities lens, which is a real mouthful. But it turns out there really is a kind of coherence there. And if all we get tonight on this episode is as far as sewing together these various parts, enough to make plausible the claim that there is something like a complete whole. It doesn't do everything for you, but it hangs together. It solves the sorts of problems that it addresses, which are not all the problems that there are. For that, you need more lenses, but it hangs together and it does a great deal of work for you. It's promising. You ought to be able to take it on, and maybe without looking at these other lenses. There are, after all, a lot of different lenses, and one could try it, quite a number of them on together for fit. We're going to try 3. So this high information flow network of rich communities is the first lens, and the second one we're going to call conscious realism. And I do mean that. I don't mean only what Donald Hoffman means by that phrase, but I do mean what he means by that phrase, even though he's taking it in a much more rigorous direction. I'm taking it in a somewhat different direction, but it is very much a conscious realism, which is really quite a claim, actually. It's a bold claim, and it's a claim that one need not make when one accepts the value of this high information flow network of rich communities lens. This is a separate thing. One can add on to it. By separate, I don't mean that the various parts in each don't together do some work. I think they do some work together, so that this pair of lenses together forms a new way of looking at the world. You could try conscious realism without this high information flow network of rich communities as well. You could combine it with some other things and not that. But when you put them together, you get a yet more powerful view. So first, what are these 2 lenses individually? And then what do they do for you when they're together? That's yet another level of the conversation. And then the final lens is a further one still. And I don't have a name for it yet. So for now, I'm just calling it this free and loving integration lens. You could say that it's basically a set of claims about the nature of conscious life, the nature of love, the nature of freedom, and an account in which all of those things add into the conscious realism. They may add, these things might be held without adopting conscious realism, and perhaps without setting them inside this high information flow network of rich communities. But together, these things do a lot of work when they're brought in one after another. Then when you're looking at the world with all of the power of these lenses operating together, you have a much more robust account of the world. There are no doubt yet other lenses, but you can already see that when you put these things together, you're starting to talk about how people should live together, what the world is actually like. And you begin to get the impression that this line of inquiry is moving toward, gosh, a lot of answers to very big questions. And that's exactly the right impression. In fact, we're on our way toward the limit, which is answering all the questions in a holistic, integrated account of what the world is like, who we are in it, what we should do in it, and why. All of that. Imagine answering a whole set of that questions, having a complete account of the world, and sharing it with other people with whom you live. Pregnant pause over. Let's hang on to that idea and then dive in now to this first lens. This first lens will help us will actually make reference to that very rich ideal of thinking through life together, putting a whole account together, living it, enacting it together. That's an ideal. That theoretical, practical, holistic inquiry ideal is an ideal that that is illustrated in a certain way, in a limited way, but still a very full-bodied way by the combination of these 3 lenses, number 1. But it is also referenced in this first lens, number 2. So let's dive into this high information flow network of rich communities. And it begins like this. There are some things we're aware of. And when we're aware of things, we behave differently. There is, that is to say, such a thing as conscious information. This is information that we're conscious of, things we are aware of. I'm claiming here that not a full theory of what information is. Let me tell you all about information. There are lots of folks who have lots to say about information. And if we were going to say everything about everything, eventually we'd have to say something about all of those different accounts of information. But to start here, all we need to do is accept the idea that among things which it makes sense to call information are things that we are aware of, things that we are conscious of. And here we're trading on an idea about information. It's expressed in this little bumper sticker here. To be information is to inform. That's an interesting idea. Maybe to be information is to inform. If that's the case, then on that model, we might be the ones who are informed. When some information comes to us and we now see some things that are so we think. And we can list all kinds of things that are apparently obvious to us, things that present themselves to us, things that look as if this is the way life is, something like that. There's a wall 10 feet away from me. There's a plug in the wall, etc. The lights are on in my home. All of these things are things that I'm right now aware of. And those things could change. God forbid some of them change too drastically too fast, but the lights could go off very quickly. For example, I could lose power. And when it does, that would change how I act. That's something that I'd be aware of. When I'm doing that, I'm actually I don't just have information, I am processing information. I'm thinking through what it is that I might do given the things that I see, given the things that my senses may be involved, literally vision may be involved, or we maybe use that sight, which is so much, it turns out, of what our brain is actually doing all the time. Maybe 2/3 of our activity, brain activity devoted to it. Neuroscientists put that 2/3 more carefully than I can. But in any case, that sensory, and in particular, that vision function that we have, we can take that out by way of analogy and say that we see, we notice, we attend to, we're aware of, we are presented by, etc. All of that we're using a visual metaphor for and not taking vision literally here. So we see things in that sense and we process them. We think them through, we put two and two together. We are processing information. And when we do that, we think our choices get a bit better. Information improves our choices, not in a completely linear and universal and simple-minded sort of way, such that any more information I have is going to improve my choices in some incremental way. That's not true. But as a general rule, we do better when we don't stick our head in the sand, to use that metaphor, but when we pull it out, when we see, when we attend to the world around us, we tend to make better choices. This is not a hard sell. We could look at this more rigorously. In fact, we have, and we would need to. What do we mean by improving choices? Changing choices is one thing to say. What do we mean by improving them? What I mean by improving them, roughly, is bring about choices that we don't go back over, at least imaginatively, at least in terms of that phenomenon we call regret. We don't regret our choices. We don't think that as we process them, that all that information afresh, and maybe even more information. We don't end up wishing we had behaved differently, wishing we had even thought differently, realizing that we made a mistake, etc. We don't do that. And very often, as a general rule, our choices get better as information comes our way. Now, that's the third bullet point. Now, it turns out that all that information doesn't just come to us through our own individual investigations. We obtain information by interacting with other people. We obtain information socially, and we process that information socially. Processing it socially might mean we talk it out with other people. We think things through together. People challenge us. They say, why are you doing that? That doesn't make any sense. In fact, this is bad for all of us, someone might say, and we're called to account, and so we do account. So information is processed socially, and not only by people who think exactly like us. Now, some people do think relatively like us, and so if I'm looking for something in the other room, I don't have to go in the other room myself to see if it's there. If it's some large object, I might ask somebody in my family to go look. They do go look, and they find out, no, this small refrigerator is not in that room, right? And I take their view of the matter as sufficient for my own. And I now have information. I didn't actually have to go see it. Instead, somebody else saw it. This is a small example of information that comes to me socially. Moreover, I might think through a number of things with someone else. And we might think alike. We might perceive the world alike. We might think through the world alike. We might make choices alike. And a lot of us do on a lot of things. Really famously, a lot of us don't on a lot of things. And we have an awful lot of diversity. In fact, you might say it's something of a compelling central problem of our day, the sort of diversity we have. On one hand, we honor it. On the other hand, we're kind of mystified by it or challenged by it, or driven to some kind of hard view in light of it, whatever that hard view is. It could be that, in fact, there are more sensible people whose views we can trust, and then there are these other people, and they engage in apparently fake or not reliable, not veridical, not trustworthy information gathering in the first place. And what they pass on to us, if they believe it themselves, is fake. It's not true. Nor do they think it through very well. And they are not, they're substandard intellectually somehow. They're not only different than we are, they're worse. So that this is a blessing and a curse, this ability to surround ourselves with people who think like us or people who think differently than us. People who think differently than us, probably we all know, if they think differently than us, but not in this radically substandard sort of way that we're inclined to just push off the spectrum of those people that we have to listen to, we may actually listen to people who think differently than we do, and they may actually illuminate us. And almost all of us, no matter what kind of tug of wars we're in with regard to information flow, information processing, etc., with regard to no matter where we sit in that tug of war, we probably value people's opinions who are different than ours, recognize skills as different than ours, capabilities as different than ours, levels of insight that are different than ours. And so we benefit from a kind of diversity. On the other hand, if they're very different than we are, well, frankly, somebody who misses the refrigerator in the other room, I'm frankly not that interested in how they see the room. I want the sort of person who can tell me if there's a refrigerator in there, and that's not a hard thing to do. And if they can't, right, then I'm not very interested in their view. very simple case, but there are other sorts of cases in which I simply can't trust, I can't relate to the person whose view is sufficiently diverse from my own. So this is both a blessing and a curse, this social information processing, which enables us to gather information more efficiently when we work together, but also challenges us, blesses us with different perspectives, and challenges us with those different perspectives. Okay. The transfer of information in our social life takes place sometimes by someone just talking to us and telling us what they know. And that's what I mean by putting us in cognitive contact with their information about the world. They have information and they turn around and tell us, and they engage us. And now we say, got it, I'll save time. I won't go in the room. I won't look there. You look there, right? That is cognitive information transfer. But we transfer information not only through cognitive contact, we transfer information through a kind of, well, it's not cognitive, so let's call it non-cognitive. And let's, without trying to do this in an exhaustive way, let's give an example or two of what's meant here. So I might very well read a book with you, and then we discuss it together. And my take on the book, or you may bring the book to me, invite me to read it with you. I do read it with you. And thus, your engagement with that book occasions my engagement with that book, and the whole transfer of information, so far as we can tell in this simple case, the whole of that transfer was cognitive. You got me to think about it. I read, I think it through, we talk about it, etc. We exchange, and all the things that are happening right at the level of things that I'm thinking about, things that you're thinking about, and what we both think about, etc. It may be the case, though, in fact, if you were my parent, you may well have brought books to my attention, and you may well have read those books, but you actually didn't pass all of the information about that was in those books to me through some sort of cognitive contact. You might, for example, have read a great many books, and you might have pulled some that you thought would be particularly beneficial to me. And you might have put me in cognitive contact with those books. And those books may improve my life in general. When I read, my life gets richer, I make better choices, etc. But it may also be that the things that you read that you didn't put in my path may also have improved my choices. And if you didn't put them in my path, they didn't improve my choices by me thinking about them. They improved my choices by you thinking about them. And you setting something, call it a library, a children's library, call it an upbringing in a home, call it a curriculum in a school. You shaped that based upon a lot of contact with things that I don't have to come in contact with in order for my choices to be shaped by the information. You read those books. You had something to say about them. You thought you'd save me some time. And so I didn't read those books. I didn't even know about those books. And yet I selected a rich, a group of books to read that was richer, according to whom, at least according to you, that was richer, maybe even according to me. Now, how would I know whether it's richer according to me if I don't go read the books for myself? Well, I could go read those books for myself, and it might be true that if I were to read those books, I would think what you thought. That's possibly true. We might predict it. We might verify it. So there are truth claims, perhaps at least in some instances, about whether I would agree with you, about whether it was somehow good for me to read the things that I never read because you did first and brought about a state of affairs where I read better things rather than those things. That's an example of non-cognitive contact between information that could improve my options, that flows into me in a different sort of way. Let's shift gears from reading for a minute and to one other paradigm by way of example of non-cognitive contact. Suppose we're not reading books. Suppose we're building stuff. Suppose we are doing electronics. Suppose we are trying to transfer energy through wires, wrapped, insulated, so that that energy propagates from one point to another according to and only according to the path that I set out for it. And suppose it's the case that you've worked through a lot of materials for the wrapping of those wires. And you've gotten much better at it. Your wires no longer, after a long period of trial and error, they no longer overheat, they no longer short, which is where the energy basically leaks out in a way you didn't intend it for it to leak out. They don't overheat, they don't short, and maybe they're more efficient. Maybe there's less energy loss as the energy is transferred from one point to another through the wire. Okay. Not very technical, but a tiny little bit technical, maybe too technical. The point is, I need not know about your history of investigation of various combinations of rubber or other sorts of materials that you use for wrapping extruded copper or extruded tin or extruded, take your alloy of choice on the inside. I need not know about all of that in order for your experience to benefit me when it comes for me to sit down and transfer, to set up, to engage in electronics, to wire a device. In technology, experience can be stored. It's stored in the choice of technology. It's stored in what's in the shop. When I go into shop and I ask for wire of a certain size for a certain purpose, and I get this wire and not that wire and not that other wire and all the other sorts of wire I might have gotten, except for the fact that there's all these human beings who explored all that wire before me. And so I just get this wire. Now, it would be hard for me to know without knowing a little bit about the history of the technology, right? Who do I thank for this? And how indebted to them am I? And there's lots of questions that I might ask, but there's not much question that I might be indebted to other people. And it might be their experience with the world that puts me in, it shapes my choices in such a way that my choices are better precisely because of information that they had about the world, but that I never processed. That's a second case in technology of non-cognitive contact. Now, that's not a difficult point so far, but you could imagine going further. Notice that what I'm developing, whether in the book reading case or in the electronics case, any technology case, I'm developing a group of people here conceptually that share certain ways of looking at the world. You could say certain models of looking at the world. And the sharing of those models is a basis for a kind of trust between us. And so I think of my place in the history of science as standing on the shoulders of giants, or something like that. Those sorts of expressions are used, and we mean that in a positive way. We weren't trying to avoid the giants and conflict with them when we're standing on their shoulders. No, we're indebted to them. We can reach what we can reach because they've boosted us, they've assisted us. And the same thing is true, although perhaps a little bit more controversially, with regard to the way I might have been brought up in a home. It might be the case that parents, and not only parents, but grandparents and uncles and aunts and social relations of all sorts, might have known some things, might have lived what we might call a cultured life. I don't mean that there's just a single culture here, not at all. Really, just the opposite. But people might share a culture amongst themselves, and they might pass it on. Now we're talking about a community, and if that community endures over time and passes it on to one generation after another, it sounds like an old community. And one way of phrasing that is the idea of tradition. We have traditions. Now, imagine ourselves then, just for a moment, as sitting in various sorts of communities with various sorts of histories, call them various sorts of traditions. Now, these are not communities that have in common everything they think, and not at all. One might not even aspire towards such a thing, but it certainly is the case that one might fail to have it. One could quite easily just have some things in common with some people. We might nonetheless call that a community in some sense. The fishing community, the linguistic community, the all kinds of different things. The union, all kinds of groups. And there's certain kinds of shared models, shared trust there. And to the extent that we live in a network of trust, to the extent that we live in a network where we trust other people and we share similar models, they can go and process information on our behalf in a way. And so we don't have to process it all by ourselves. In a certain sense, we are parallel processing. As long as all that information gets back to us in some way, in some form, cognitively perhaps, non-cognitively also perhaps, then our choices might be impacted by information that somehow came to us, was processed, and shaped our ways forward, our decisions, etc. And that shaping might very well be a kind of parallel processing. It's just what I would have done, only I'm not doing that. I can't do all these things, but together we can do all these things. We think a lot alike, and we can share the results of what we're thinking, and we can parallel process the world in that way. In that world, insofar as I live with people under a shared model, I am not the center of, I'm not a lone actor. I'm also not the only person who knows the people that I trust. There are other people in the community who also know at least some of the people that I trust. So you could imagine a ring of people, just to use one spatial metaphor, and they trust one another, and we're all related to one another in a certain way. And here we need a kind of image. So imagine, to start with, there are four of us, and we connect them not only in the square, but across the diagonals. So everybody's related to everybody else. And in that sense, I'm not the center of a relationship of trust that's very different than this other person is. Their relationship, their trusting relationships are just like mine. You could imagine growing such a network. You could imagine saying, hey, this works pretty well to have other people that we trust. Let's grow this further. Let's invite more people. Let's grow the range of things that we're looking for information for. Let's build larger and larger models that we share, that we use to process the information as we encounter it, and relay results to one another, and process information together in this large, ever increasing parallel processing structure. You could imagine taking the limit of that activity. I mean, the limit, the way one would take the limit in calculus, or pushing it to its limits, go to the extreme. And what could such a community do? Well, it could do everything. It could think through the whole world. It could think through quite a bit. The sky's the limit. Add more people, add more time, add more generations, add more expertise, add more models, build this whole thing out, and you have a coherent, consistent, structured way of life that has a remarkable surface area and processes almost everything up to everything and anything. Call that whole thing a rich community. And here I'm referring to rich communities in precisely this usage. High information flow networks of rich communities. What's a rich community? I've just described one. It's information rich. It is also shared model rich. It is trusting relationships rich. But of course, it is remarkably poor also, so far as I've described it, in other respects. Come back to what we said here about diversity, not choices, but diversity. We can learn from not only people who are like us, but also people who are not like us, people who challenge the way we look at things, people who could see things only because they've got a different model that they're working with. They pursue different leads, they discover different things, they build a different account. It's an account that challenges us. It's an account that may complement what we have to say, may replace what we have to say, may enrich what we have to say, but is far from the same as what we have to say. And we've got a fair bit of information to gather about that different model from those different diverse voices in order to understand what they have to say. Even to understand what it is that they think, we have to enter in and listen to their way of looking at the world. It's not impossible, it turns out, for us to look at the world in more than one way. We can set one way aside and we can imaginatively enter into and say, what is it like to think the way that person thinks? Just for a moment. They may be crazy. I've got no reason to believe what they think, but I may have enough reason to investigate what they think. Without believing them, I may want to help them. They may need help. They may be in my way and I have to move them out of my way in order to accomplish what I want to accomplish. So I need to figure out rhetorically what's an effective strategy for convincing them to see the world differently and to jump on board this better, clearer thinking way forward, all according to me. All of that might be my motivation, but I won't understand what it is that they think unless I step into the model that they have and understand that the world, the model that was constructed by them about the world may be rich, at least a little rich, in the way that the models constructed in my community life might be rich, at least a little rich. They may actually live in a rich community, or they may have inherited work that was done in a rich community, and it may not be the same community. It may not be the same models. They may be very differently than we are. So we talked about parallel processing of information, but we might also want complementary processing of information. And there I mean precisely a different filter, not my rose-colored glasses, but their wine-colored or blue, or pick your metaphor, some other set of shades. They see the world differently. They look at the world, they pop out an analysis of what's the case, what's to be done, etc., that is complementary to mine. And I might process information not only by relating to the people whom I trust, in the sense that we share the same view of the world. They go out, they gather information, they report it to me, it fits right in for me. I can parallel process with them. I can't parallel process with this radically different alternative thinking person. I can barely understand the information or whether they have any. In order to understand it, though, I can step out in a different kind of thought. It's not parallel processing. It is picking up imaginatively and entering into their way of looking at things. How do I know when I get it right? Well, how do I know when I get my model right in my own community? Well, we articulate that model and people say, yeah, that's right. I mean, this is why we proceed the way we proceed. Somebody might stop me and they might say, hey, wait, why are you doing that? And they may appeal to a whole bunch of things that she and I share in our model. And now I have to justify my behavior. And I might actually be corrected in my behavior and say, you're right. I see now how you see it. This is actually how we see it. And I wasn't seeing it that way. Now I do, right? That kind of activity can happen inside of a great deal of like-mindedness in our social, intellectual, practical relations. In the same way, when do I know that I actually am now in contact with the information as that other person is processing it through her different lenses, from her different perspective, from her complementary point of view? How do I know? Well, she has to tell me. She has to say, no, wait, if you want to understand the world the way we look at it, you have to understand it like such. And now that may be, as I was sort of brought up over time in the world that I was brought up in, developing the lenses that I developed with my like-minded friends, it may be really quite a challenge to grow up in a certain way, to think like an adult, to exchange information from one adult to another, both really richly appreciating the model that has been developed, but to do all that imaginatively. This may be a task. On the other hand, I've done something like it once. Every time I exchange, we are, after all, not exactly the same over here, not precisely. So there's always some listening, some application of the model in a new context, in a different context. That whole process is probably somewhat helpful. And it might be done in such a way that I always was aware that there are other people who think, have diverse experiences, diverse mindsets, diverse perspectives, different models. And I might have been stretched as reading books written by people with very different points of view, for example. That might have happened to me as I've grown up. So I may not be without resources as I jump in to this other person's point of view. And I might be able to, what shall we say, grow up fast to become an adult who's got the mature model over in that second community, that achievement of first language competency, my becoming a mature member imaginatively of another way of looking at the world. That whole thing might happen faster the second time than the first time, especially if it's been nurturing and in a certain way been happening regularly or all the time. Less so if that hasn't been happening. It may be quite a leap to get there. I may have to really transform the way I approach folks. But that's a second kind of complementary processing. What do you do with the fact we're already imagining ourselves in a world which is kind of like the world we inhabit now, except so far nobody's threatening civil war with one another. Nobody's calling the other people a libtard or a right-wing nutjob, to wax political for a moment, or a heretic, or you pick the language, right? People who don't think right. How about just weird? Just different. How's it supposed to work in this environment? How could it work? What else could we, who think the way we think and have inherited the tradition through our whole process of cognitive education and our whole non-cognitive, cultural, technological, in every other sort of way, non-cognitive, all of that shaping me the way I'm shaped into a citizen of my country, an adherent of my faith, a member of my family, and I probably should have started those from small to large rather than from very large to small. But the point is, this is the way we are, this is the way we think, proud to be blank, fill in the blank. But we do recognize that there are others. How ought we to relate to one another? Well, now we're in this world of communities and traditions, and we're imagining these are rich communities. And they are engaged together in, at their limit, were they to grow, holistic, theoretical and practical inquiry. We could be solving problems with people who think like us and growing that group of people who think like us, so that we're parallel processing the world with somehow information coming in from complementary processing as well, but that information being much harder to grasp in a certain way, requiring us to enter into empathetically, systematically, imaginatively into someone else's way of looking at the world. What do we do in this world? Do we simply have rival ways inside our heads? Do we simply embrace inconsistency? There's this way, there's that way. These are not the same, let's suppose. We don't have to really suppose. We know there's lots of different ways of looking at the world. What do we do in this sort of circumstance? Well, imagine that we approach this systematically in the following way. Imagine we write the following algorithm for our social information processing. Imagine those of us who parallel process the world systematically confront, engage, interact with, compete with, take your pick, but systematically seek out other ways of looking at the world. Not because we know there's anything to what they have to say. There might not be. Or there might be. It's a good question. Who has to settle that question in the end? Well, I do. And maybe there's others who are kind of like me. And so perhaps insofar as I bring information in and inform them and we process it, perhaps we do. We have to be the judge. We have our standards. But there are other standards. There are other ways of processing the world, other ways to look at it. And suppose we systematically confront them and we take the time to go through this process with them. Moreover, we invite them to do the same with us. So we invite them to send. Some of their people stay right where they are, and a further subset of those people spend some time helping me. Are they generous enough to do so, trying to understand the world as they see it? And yet they're resource rich enough that they spare yet a few more adults. And those adults, one or more of them, come and they take the same exploratory investigation in my community, in my parallel processed, richly modeled account of the world. They come and they enter into that imaginatively in the same way that I go and enter into that imaginatively. And when they come here, they understand what it is we think here precisely when we tell them they do. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have their own standards of judgment that are not ours, and they may much prefer them to ours, all fine and good. But if they want to come here and they want to ask, they want to find out what the model is that guides us as we work our way through the world, in that limited respect, they come submissive to us. They know what we think when they say what we think, and we say, oh yeah, that is what we think. You've got it. You can actually play the part of an adult imaginatively as if you were on stage. You can play the part of an adult in space. You actually do predict. We could ask you, we could include you, we could send you out, and you could come back, and you'd come back with the very same sort of information, thinking like us as any of our mature members do. And we put you to the test in that regard. And sure enough, you can do it. You can maybe even help us solve some new problems, thinking like us. And that same thing might happen to me. And that same thing might happen to my friends, like-minded, right-thinking friends who think like I do and who yet are sent out in this exploration of complementary perspectives in other directions, not in the community that I went, but yet others. So we do this exchange, and we achieve through this exchange, again, the language I used, and I'm borrowing it from a famous philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, thank you. We achieve a kind of second first language competency through this exchange. And so now we have people who think differently from one another, and yet who understand richly what one another thinks. Now, if that's the case, we should stop and notice something for a moment. Several things. First, to get where I am, I've been put in touch with a lot of information. Not only the information I cognitively processed, but the information that other people cognitively processed that benefits, that shapes the way it may or may not benefit. That's an empirical claim. I might systematically go back and explore some of those. And I may find out I was not done well by things. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's necessarily good, right? But it might be. It might be like the wire covering. And as a matter of fact, to take the easy technological case, I might think those people did a remarkably good job. And my life is much better. I'm more technically rich. I'm much better educated in technology because of what they did. And I don't know all the reasons why, and I don't conduct all their experiments or explore every blind alley they ran down. I may have a sketch of the main ones that might help me understand them better, but I don't have it all. And instead, their experience is stored in the wires on the shelf, in the alloys, in it may be just a number, and I order that number. I look up the book. I pull open the book, I pull open drop in my specifications. What do I want? And out comes some numbers of materials, some parts numbers in effect, and I buy those things. And those things work for me time after time. And I say, boy, isn't this great? So it is possible then for me to have this to be in contact with information. It's not necessary. It doesn't always happen. I'm not trying to swallow hook, line, and sinker all of tradition. I'm trying to say that in tradition, there is the possibility of this non-cognitive contact with information that in fact improves my choices. And if somebody else comes in from the outside and becomes an adult like me, he or she sings those same tunes. He or she knows how to look up in the catalog, knows how to order the parts, knows how to plug them in. So she is now in contact with the information that improves my choices. And if I do the same thing in her tradition and achieve that same second first language competency, that same imaginative maturity, then I myself am now in contact with not only with the books that I read to get there, the books she recommended, but the books which her predecessors did not recommend and moved to the side, the technologies that were tried and left behind, and left undone. All of that, I now benefit. My choices are now in contact with all that information. And the two of us, she who came to my tradition and I who came to hers, the two of us are in remarkably informed circumstances, much better informed than either one of us would have been in our own traditions had we stayed at home. Now, you might think that you might think that we've solved in a certain way the problem of complementarity, the problem of we benefited from the diversity, and we apparently have resolved the problem of being in contact with different sorts of information, building different models, seeing the world differently, processing the world differently, going on in our different ways differently. Haven't we solved that problem? Because aren't we now both in contact with all the same information? We're making progress, but no. Why not? Because it may be the case that she may imaginatively enter into and be in contact with the information that shaped my way of looking at the world, but she doesn't buy a word of it, or she's highly skeptical of it, or she knows much better than it. She's got resources from her way of looking at the world, which change not what she is able to imagine and correctly predict that I would say, but change whether or not she believes it when she says, like I say, what I say. She may have a very different interior life. You might say we both have the same set of lenses. Now we both know the same models, sort of. We're both in contact with the same models. And through those models, through the whole set of information, histories that led to the creation of those models, we're in contact with the same stuff, but in a different order. She, from her perspective, bringing her initial formation, coloring what it is she saw. And yet, when I grew up and saw all the things that I saw in my community, I had none of that filtering. I took it in I don't really want to say unfiltered, but in a filter which was shaped by my very different set of circumstances than hers. And the same thing is true with respect to my experience in her world. So now we have, of the same information, at least on the surface, it looks like it's the same information. She may actually know what it's like to think like me. So say I, when I hear her say how it is that I think. She may have that, but she's nonetheless not the same as me. We seem to have a kind of better informed incommensurability, or big fancy word for we just don't know how to proceed from here. She sees the same things that I do, but she sees those things differently. And I see the same things that she does, but those things differently. I may even know what it's like to come back skeptically about my own life. I can, after all, put on her way of looking at the world and imaginatively re-enter my own from her point of view. Holding on, I may not share her point of view. I may not be converted to it. I don't process the world in terms of it, in terms of what I actually think is happening. But I do know that that's how she processes the world, and I can play that game too, and I bring that game home, and I look around from her perspective in my world. Isn't that interesting? Now, in a certain way, I'm seeing myself from another person's point of view. And so is she, if she does the same thing. We still haven't been formed the same way. But gosh, are we starting to put a lot of things in common. Not only contact with the same information, but even an understanding of how that information looks from to one another. Is this possible, by the way? You sure can describe it. You sure can imagine it. We could pursue another time historical cases. Can people actually do this? Can real people do this? Is this a mark of an educated person that they can do this? All good questions. I think the answer to all of that is yes. By the way, tipping my hand. And not just my hand. A lot of people think the answer to that is yes. So far, we haven't done anything to erode the real diversity of perspectives, the real difference. Even though we see the same stuff, we look at the same stuff differently, not just from one point of view, even from both points of view, we look at the same thing differently. Wow. How about this, though? Suppose it were the case that when she comes my way and she looks around in my world, and then she brings my perspective back and looks around at hers the way I would look at hers. Suppose it's the case that she now sees solutions to problems that are her problems, that are part of the problems that her way of looking at the world is currently facing. And she sees solutions to those problems that she didn't see before. Maybe when she brings for me my perspective back to her world, and she looks at it from that point of view, maybe she sees explanations of how those problems arose and of why those problems were going to be big problems and why they're going to be stuck there. Because if you look at it through the model we have over here, they short-suited themselves over there. They looked at it inadequately over there. They overlooked some very important things that we in our perspective have. And now she brings back and looks at herself from that perspective and says, oh boy, when I look at it from that perspective, this sure looks a whole lot more promising. But she doesn't share my perspective. But what if the perspective that she holds when she imaginatively adopts mine happens to transform? What if she sees a way forward from her own point of view, thinking like she thinks, but being informed through her rich immersion in this life, my life, and she goes back and sees the world through a more powerful set of lenses that are really hers and not mine, though they were shaped by mine. Her real lenses now, which are different still than my real lenses now after my whole exchange, they're different, informed very, very richly through very common and complementary but different dives into the same sorts of experiences, using the same sorts of models, engaging the worlds in same sorts of ways imaginatively. Those may have now changed her and may have now changed me in ways which happen now to agree. Maybe it's the case that she sees, still looking at the world the way she looked at it, as if there are new things which they need to bring to the table. They can see them from their point of view, having become immersed in ours. They don't share our point of view. They take it on imaginatively. They don't buy it entirely. Their mind is shaped through their own experiences, which are parallel to mine, but different to mine in spite of this very rich set of exchanges. She's got her own point of view. And yet both of us agree, perhaps, that their way of moving forward would benefit, and perhaps our way of moving forward for a different set of reasons would benefit if we moved forward together. She for her reasons, I for mine, both sets of reasons, richly informed with contact with real information, both cognitive and non-cognitive, in rich communities, but which at the same time maintain, respect, require diversity, different experiments in being human beings and thinking through the world, not just in this one cookie cutter parallel processed world, but in many of them, in theory, in any of them, in all of them. And maybe it's the case that we move forward through these rich information exchanges, not washing over or bypassing our differences, but becoming enriched through the common experiences we take on out of our differences. That environment I just described is a high information flow network of rich communities. It's a beautiful thing. And it isn't clear that we couldn't be living that way now. Let's push a little further. Imagine it's the case that through a series of exchanges like these, The perspectives which develop more simply, more short-sightedly from a particular set of perspectives. Imagine those sets of perspectives, that model of the world, that way of living out life in this world, understanding it the way we understand it in parallel with one another. We should pause and notice this hardly ever happens. How could it ever happen? Should it ever happen? We're looking forward right now to the should. What would happen if it did happen? Could it ever happen? We're starting to motivate the possibility that it could happen, but just barely motivating it. And you'd be right to be deeply skeptical. A fairy story could never happen, perhaps. Maybe. Let's grant that difficulty for a moment and just talk about whether it would be good if it did. Where would it go if it did? Imagine a community then, however it gets here, that lives a long time, that parallel processes, that extends the capabilities of its members. Presumably, it would have to have the kind of education that imagines the exchanges that I just talked about at some great length. It would have to empower those kinds of exchanges, and yet hang on to people, work out together, putting in common together as much as they can find to agree upon, and holding that in common and the other areas in dispute, but in dispute among people with common mind, common purpose, common way of life. And that whole parallel processing enterprise goes forward for a long period of time, with also rich exchanges of the sorts that I just imagined. And it doesn't result in people jumping ship and going and living in those other ways of life. Instead, people enriched from those ways of life come back and say there's still something right, and something now more richly understood about the enterprise we're engaged in. And we want to stay engaged in that enterprise, and we want to stay engaged in it together, and we want to push it forward, and we don't mind if it takes a long time. What you're seeing develop in that history of exchange between communities is a kind of stability. And that stability is an interesting feature that such a group might have or lack. It's a property, and one could measure it almost. One could imagine measuring it. How long would be one of the questions you'd ask. How many people? Through how many exchanges? Of what sorts of exchanges? With how rich of various sets of communities, etc. One could bring all of those parameters together and imagine a kind of stability that emerges through what are sort of intellectually very rough seas. And now it turns out you have some people who can sail, and they have a craft of hanging together as an interpretive vessel of the world, as a ship, as a way of working through life together. And that stability could be a real feat. Imagine a theoretical ideal of stability through any such and all such engagements, where people are willing to, if they needed to, they value the full information contact paradigm. They go where the evidence leads, and they understand there's different takes on the evidence, and they're willing to look at it from multiple points of view none of which calls into question this emerging and powerful point of view, which they themselves hold and which they share with others in some kinds of ways. Some of those people may come in and become part of this whole perspective. And now it turns out there's multiple ways, multiple paths to become a mature member of this community. Not just somebody who understands what mature members in this community think and verifiably understands what they think, but somebody who thinks that way himself or herself, and thus comes in as a full contributing member and takes on and contributes to the biggest challenges that this community has and faces and overcomes, so that these people from outside become valued insiders. And now the ideal of an insider is a bit different. Now it's a question of what you're committed to, not where you came from and what you used to be committed to. And that kind of stability might grow over time. And the theoretical ideal might be to endure through any kind of engagement with any kind of rival. It is, of course, possible that a couple of different ways of looking at the world, I'm only picking two, take your favorite number, at least two different ways of looking at the world might pass through the world, amassing resources, processing information in this parallel and sometimes complementary sort of processing paradigms. These two might actually recognize in one another different ways of looking at the world, which they simply cannot find reasons to adopt the one rather than the other. They're different. They're powerful. There are lots of people who have lots of reasons for adopting one or the other, but it's not the case that all the people have reasons for adopting just the one rather than the other. They, in effect, adopt them both. And they don't know what to think about that state of affairs. I once, on the sidelines of a soccer game, was delighted to run into a surgeon who was at the same time an acupuncturist. Because I'd always wanted to ask someone who'd practiced sort of Western medicine and a certain kind of non-Western medicine. I'd wanted to ask, how do those things come together for you? And the response I got was, well, they don't come together at all. Said, I do not know how to bring them together. I don't even try. I just recognize problems which submit better from one form of thinking than another. And I put that one on and I solve those problems. That's a person with really two minds, and they're okay with that. They might be interested, really interested in how they come together. And maybe they cause problems for one another somewhere, someplace. But at least for the time being, they don't cause so many problems that the person can't take them both on and live them both out. And that's precisely what he was doing. So maybe this isn't just a theoretical possibility, maybe it could actually happen. If that's the case, we could imagine that there are two ways to fulfill, at least two, to fulfill this sort of theoretical ideal of stably, maximally informed engagement with the world. These days, we might say they both have their accounts of the world, they both have their truths, and they both have evidence that the claims they make are superior to a great many, almost every rival, except this other one about which they don't know what to say. That's a possibility. So also is the possibility that somebody cleverly finds a way to incorporate what all of these people know from their different points of view, what they all value, and brings them into some single, invites them into some single, more powerful way of looking at the world. That ideal of a single, stable, powerful, explanatory, guiding way of looking at the whole of the world, that ideal is the ideal of truth on this model. It's not neutral ground. It's the world from a certain perspective, but it's a certain perspective that has earned its chops and has hung on and achieved a kind of stability, a kind of rhetorical persuasiveness from any point of view, and has grown the craft so far practiced, never achieved theoretically in some ideal, but practiced against all comers so far in a way which effectively invites mature members in those rarefied, unusual contexts of full information exchange of the sort that I just described at some length. That's the ideal of truth on Alistair McIntyre's account of craft, tradition, rationality, at least as I understand it. So then there is an account of truth, and we're not far behind as an account of what it is for things to be good for a person. We talked about this point of view, this model illuminating, explaining, predicting, helping us control, illuminating, but also guiding. Where on earth should we go? Well, where do the mature members of this community, maximally in touch with information, where do their improved choices migrate? Where do they want to sail? They are, you might say, free. You notice there's been no external account here of where one ought to go, what one ought to think, how one ought to conform one's view of the world to the reality that's out there. We started with the way the world looks to us and said that it looks to us is a kind of information, may not be the only kind of information, but now it turns out that the way the world looks to us turns out to be a particularly powerful kind of information. One might be able to construct an account of the world, including an account of what's true about the world, all from the inside. There is no external world on this account that was appealed to guide us so that we get it right. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we think is right, not according to us. There are some things, they look stupid. No way are we going to do it that way. No way does that seem true. No way does the world seem like that. But we're inside and we're seeming all the time. And we're reconciling the seemings and we're reconciling the desirings. And we're building out of that something which, from our own experience, it turns out, doesn't just go in any direction, but goes in some directions. And insofar as one can build a powerful account that can richly understand its rivals and effectively invite its rivals into, to contribute to in some ways, to learn from in other ways, to be part of all things together. this way of looking at the world, this coherent, larger account that has recognized real diversity, benefited from real diversity, and in some ways incorporated real diversity, because people are in this model, in this community, having come in from different points of view, which are not eliminable. They're not false points of view. They're their own points of view. And they're the reasons why a person of that type would be attracted to this way of life. And they are legion. There is many kinds of pathways in as there are kinds of people and kinds of models about the world that we might construct. And those are incorporated, but they're brought together in a more powerful, ever more powerful sets of ways of looking at the world. And one could imagine an ideal of bringing in everybody in a stable, rich, and one now has to add enjoyable, chosen destination. This is where we want to go together. This is how we understand the world. This is why we want to go here. This is where we're going. There is here then the judgments of mature members of this rich community, the stable, rich community, the judgments of mature members are in conformity with this ideal of stability. They are true. And the choices, the inclinations, the pursuits, the goals set by those mature members are good. And the rights, the needs that they recognize other people in the community to have, that they judge to be needs that should be satisfied for the community as a whole to advance. Those needs whose satisfaction it's in the best interest, the judgments of the mature members of the community to satisfy or to ensure are satisfied. Those are rights. Those needs are rights. And those demands which anybody makes on anyone else in the community that are upheld by the judgments of mature members of people in this community, insofar as this community is stable, insofar there may be more than one of them again at any one point in time, but this theoretical ideal of coming together in an ever more powerful sort of way that may or may not be realized, whether it is an empirical question. But that the set of demands that are made that are recognized as productive demands by the mature members of this community, those demands are duties. They are obligations. And so what we have is a stable community account of truth, of goodness, and let's say of right, let's say of morality. Let's say what morality is this craft of living well as a human being, all things considered, insofar as that craft is exhibited particularly in the mature members of community, ones who are formed in the full exposure to the information that this community has processed collectively. Now, one could stop and one could call this a high information flow network of rich communities. One could notice that there's an account of truth, of goodness, there's an account of morality that's woven into this framework. And one could notice that it is empirical. It is, there are questions you can ask, there are test conditions one can specify. This person from this community is a mature member of that community. So say all the identified candidates for maturity in that community in a simple case. This is a mature member. This mature member was brought in. This mature member gained second first language competency. So say all the candidates or a sufficient number of the candidates, there may be shortcuts here, right, for maturity in this community, all of the plausible candidates. That's ultimately some large group of people who say we are, and those are not. They are not yet. And according to that large group, this person came in and understood what it is that this large group has to say. And those are conditions. They are hard to manifest. They're hard to produce. They take a lot of time, kind of like digging an unbelievably long tunnel, 17 kilometers around at the Swiss-French border, and dropping a vacuum pipe in it, surrounded by incredibly powerful magnets and scattering particles one into the other, and then taking pictures of everything that comes out. Unbelievably hard, difficult set of circumstances to bring into existence, but not impossible. And it's where scientific data comes from. I'm making reference to the LHC, Large Hadron Collider. In the same way, there is a possibility already sketched in what's come here, just tonight. Already sketched is the possibility of an empirical test. Are there people who are mature members in one community who, when they encounter maturity in a full imaginative engagement in this second sort of community, remain thinking the way they think, or do they instead make certain changes, and what are those changes, and do those changes include real membership in this community according to all these mature members in this community, including this fledgling new mature member in this community? Do they all agree that this person is now in? Did that happen? And does it happen again? And under what conditions? Under what sort of, raised in what sort of community, etc. This is a kind of computation. It's a kind of information processing which has got measurables associated with it. And it's in the history of the engagement between mature members of rival rich communities that the evidence exists about whether or not one of them or both of them or neither of them has in fact the rhetorical resources to persuade and invite. And in that sense, overcome, prove a kind of superiority in the same sense that we say, I now understand it better. I regret what I did. I have a better way of looking at it. In that very same sense of superiority, is it possible to mark the conditions for rational superiority of one tradition over another? And can one, through the history of exchanges, whether that history is contrived as a set of experimental conditions, or whether they happen, as when Augustine goes to see, is it Simplicianus? No, Augustine goes to see Faustus, who is the Manichae, the guy who all the Manichaees said, man, you ask good questions, Augustine, but wait till Faustus gets here. When he gets here, he's the dude who knows everything about Manichaeism. He'll answer your questions. And Faustus shows up one day, and Augustine asks him all his questions. And Faustus says of Augustine, wow, those are good questions. Those are really, really good questions. I do not know how to answer those questions. And now it turns out that no Manichaees knew how to answer Augustine's questions, though they recognized those were just the right questions. And pretty soon Augustine left. That is a data point that happens on accident in a way. I don't mean it wasn't done on purpose by Augustine, but it wasn't conceived of as a scientific test exactly, but it was in fact a contribution in the history of particular kinds of engagements between mature members of sufficiently rich communities. It was a very noteworthy historical data point. In this busy world, how could we ever cash in on that possibility of a new kind of science? Could we build communities like that, rich communities? Could we lace them together, rethink of ourselves as being part of a somewhat, to some degree, high information flow, maybe really throttled and poor information flow, but aspirationally, a high information flow network of aspirationally rich communities? Could we build that? Could we think of ourselves that way? Could we put it to the test? Could we even specify experimental conditions? And could we gather data on people in those conditions? And could we feed that data into a machine learning environment? And can we predict more quickly from kinds of behavior that are easily accessible and not this rarefied set of experimental conditions? Could we learn to predict how people would perform under those rarefied experimental conditions by looking at other kinds of correlations that can be reliably and more commonly observed? And could we then have an AI assisted high information flow network of rich communities and a computational science of community building, community engagement, which Aristotle would have called politics? Could we have a computational politics as master science, as a science of all of these, all of the rest of the sciences, one might imagine, have their place in each of these communities? They take place in universities and in national labs and in research and development arms of corporations and in all the places that science takes place. All of that science, disciplinary as it is, takes place, but begins to feed, begin to look for, in it, individuals begin to look from of the result at the results from one scientific tradition to another, to yet another discipline, etc., and could, out of the many disciplinary efforts, a small number of people, not a huge number of people, put in common what they have in common, shaped by their awareness, their exposure to the information processing that take place in all of these disciplines? And could all of that information be brought to bear on the construction of a way of looking at the world, which some, presumably small, presumably ideally better educated group of people build together live out together, choose in light of together, a way forward together? Could you begin to build a rich community that is guided by this? It's guided by all of the input from all of the scientific disciplines, but it understands itself provisionally as a best set of answers for how we might put the whole world together, yet to be assembled, even if it's a very early and preliminary set. And it builds a league of other folks who start from very different places, who also try to build rich interdisciplinary communities and try intentionally to grow their internal surface area so they can parallel process the world together, bringing up undergraduates and graduate students into the flow, living expressed community life. A strange thing these days. Could they live together? I don't mean to specify too carefully how that might happen, but according to whatever best practices seem to emerge. Could they live together? Could they encourage similar sorts of diverse way of living? And could a university infrastructure bring these communities into conversation? All the while, all the young members of these communities growing in their capability of richly understanding other people from those other people's perspectives, yet without making gray, that is, no model at all of how all these pieces fit together, or every person comes up with his or her own model, and shutting the door on parallel processing among like-minded and mutually trusting individuals. Could we instead recognize value diversity as exploration of the human rational space, practical and theoretical? How might we think? How might we act? Let's explore it. Let's explore it in diverse environments, and let's bring together a set of conditions when the time is right, insofar as the time is right, for the kinds of rich immersions, each into the other, that's required for actually the science of politics to advance. Could we do all of that? And could we do it in a computationally enhanced sort of way in which artificial intelligence comes to be in the service of particular communities for particular community purposes? And comes to be guided by the kinds of wisdom, practical and theoretical, that emerge in these rich community contexts. All of that is a set of possibilities. No mention of conscious realism or of love or freedom or any of these other things. No mention of a ton of other things we might talk about, but a great deal mentioned. It is by itself a possibility, an aspiration, an invitation. It's a lens that we could adopt. That's it for now. Thanks.